If you're new with us, we've been in John's Gospel for a long time now, and this is actually the second sermon as a part of John chapter 13 that we first studied last week. And we're talking about lessons learned in humility. And the title is simply Humble Yourself. And maybe you're here this morning like, I don't need to hear 2 sermons on humility. Well, maybe you do. And we're going to be studying these verses yet once again. And just to kind of catch you up in case you did miss last Sunday, it is Thursday evening. Jesus will be crucified Friday night. He will die. He's hours away from the cross, and he's in an upper room with his disciples, pouring into them. But it's very private. It's very personal. There's no miracles. There's no more public teaching. There's no more conflict with religious leaders. He's got his 12 disciples, and he's got their full attention. And many people refer to what is taking place in this upper room as the upper room discourse. In John's Gospel, he records 4 chapters, all of which takes place in this upper room. And but it starts off with something very amazing. It starts off with Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And this wasn't some ceremony, this big, long, elaborate thing like, watch me do this to you now. It wasn't planned necessarily. God knew it was going to happen. But it wasn't planned. It was simply a spur-of-the-moment opportunity for Jesus to do something very humbling for the people that he loved most. And those are the lessons that we're going to learn from him. Notice, I mentioned it last week. I'll say it again. We're not learning lessons of humility from Mark Nichols. Because why? Because Mark Nichols is full of pride. And we're not going to learn lessons of humility from the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Jewish bigwigs. Why? Because they're full of pride. They're wanting to kill Jesus because he's becoming more popular than they were. And so the lesson that we're going to learn, these lessons that we're learning about how to be humble, come from who you would expect them to come from. It's coming from Jesus Christ himself. Now, we didn't talk about it last week, but I want to mention it this week, and you probably know it, but it was very customary in that day to wash your feet before you ate a meal together with somebody. In our homes today, when you go into someone's house, you will wash your hands. Why? Because your hands are what you primarily use to shovel food into your face, right? And you want those hands to be clean. But in Bible times, it was customary to wash your feet before eating dinner with somebody. Why? Well, because they came in from walking dusty roads. They didn't have paved roads. They didn't even have socks. They had open-toed sandals. And after walking all day, your feet would become dirty and grimy. And while you would eat, you would be reclined at a table on your side. Your head would be towards the food, and you would grab food with your other hand that you weren't leaning on and put it in your mouth, and your feet would be away from the table. And you wouldn't want the odor of feet to ruin your meal, would you? Hey, would you like some toe jam with that bread? You know, it wouldn't be that way. You would want your feet to be cleaned. And so before eating, it was customary that the servant of the house would wash the feet of those who were eating. Only on this particular Thursday night, as they were getting ready to partake of the Passover meal together, guess what? There's no servant to be found. It's interesting. Peter and John were given the instructions to go make preparations to make this meal ready. And apparently in their planning and their organizing, guess what they forgot to do? They forgot to make sure that there was a servant there to wash feet. And I can imagine, this is purely speculation on my part, imagination. They walk into this room, it's beautifully organized, it's beautifully laid out. They're getting ready to enjoy this final serious Passover. And they're reclining and they're wondering to themselves, I don't see the servant. Way to go, Peter. You forgot to organize the servant to wash. What are we going to do now? How about you wash my feet, Peter? I'm not washing your feet. I'm better than you are. I'm the rock on which the church is going to be built. Jesus told us all. Weren't you there? And they were having this tremendous debate as to who was better, as who was the greatest. And in that moment, that is when Jesus gets up quietly and silently and washes feet. And it's so quiet that you could hear a pin drop, right? And with that act of humility, Jesus teaches us 9 lessons. We learned 4 of them last week. We're going to talk about the other 5 this week. But I want to quickly review the first 4. And if you were here last week, in those 4 lessons that we learned, 2 of the lessons we were told about when to humble yourself, and the other 2 lessons we were told how to humble yourself. First of all, when to humble yourself? Hey, when it's hard to love, humble yourself. Remember last week we talked about there in verse 1 that it detailed the fact that Jesus was going through a very, very difficult time in his life. Probably the most stressful time in his entire earthly ministry. Verse 1 of John chapter 13 says that it was the feast of the Passover. It tells us that it was Jesus' hour, that it was at hand. It was time for him to die. But that didn't prevent Jesus from loving his disciples to the end. And none of us could have blamed Jesus if he would have focused on himself. Look, Jesus, we understand you're going through a hard time. You take some time here. You serve yourself. We get it. None of us would have blamed him for that, but that's not what he did. He humbled himself and he loved his own who were in the world till the end. That's what he did. Second lesson we learned from Jesus was that when it's personal and painful, humble yourself. And it tells us in verse 2 that Judas was there. And we all know about Judas, how he was the betrayer. But if you've ever been betrayed, then you know how personal and painful betrayal is. And what's interesting is that Judas is getting his feet washed too. When it's personal and painful, humble yourself. The next 2 lessons we learned last week were how to humble yourself. How can I do that? It's hard for me to humble myself. How can I do that? Well, get the big picture. Verse 3 details the fact that Jesus knew that God was in control. That God was in control of how it was going to end. That's what sovereignty means. But verse 3 also details that Jesus was secure with his own identity, who God said he was. Did you catch it there? It said, knowing that he had come forth from God and that he was going back to God. It seems kind of out of place, doesn't it? Verse 3. But the reason that it's there is because how was Jesus able to humble himself and wash these men's feet? Well, it's because he remembered that God was in control, that the ending was secure. And he remembered who he was in God. He was very secure with his identity. I don't need to prove my greatness to anybody. I don't need you out here to show you that I'm somebody pretty impressive. He knew who he was. And that helps you and I humble ourselves too. If we know that God has the ending in control, under wraps, if you will, and if we know who we are in Jesus, that helps us tremendously because we're not out to impress people. And then the 4th lesson, if you want to humble yourself, well then guess what? You have to do humble things. It's not just this mentality. Well, I think I'll be humble today. You have to do humble things in order to be humble. And that's what we learned from verses 4 and 5. There were 7 action words that Jesus takes in order to serve these men. And that leads me to ask, what humble actions are you taking in your life to be humble? All right, so those were the first 4 lessons, and it got us through verse 5. And now as we pick it up, we're going to learn some more lessons on humility. Are you ready? Here's the 5th lesson on humility. Don't debate, humble yourself. So picture it. Jesus is going around the table. He's washing the feet of those men who are gathered there. And so far, not a word is spoken. Until we get to who? Until we get to Peter. And this seems to be a perpetual problem for Peter. He can't keep his mouth closed. He has to say something. He's going to interject. Look at verses 6 through 9. So Jesus came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to Jesus, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. And Peter said to him, never shall you wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Simon Peter said to him, well then okay, Lord, wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. Now let me ask you a question here, because this is as practical gets. Is Peter showing humility, or is Peter showing pride? Don't answer out loud. Is Peter showing humility, or is he showing pride? I believe Peter is showing false humility. He wants to appear lowly. He wants to appear humble. Oh, Lord Jesus, there's nobody greater than you. You shouldn't be washing my feet. But we need to remember, he was the one who was engaged in a conversation about who's the greatest. And I'm going to show everybody just how great I am by appearing how humble I can be. Have you ever known a Christian to be that way? Who may be serving in a capacity, but they're doing it because they want to show you just how great they are. Well, I'm so godly and I'm so holy that I'm going to do this. You ever known that? Make a note of this. There is much pride in false humility. Peter's like, never are you going to wash my feet. And Jesus is like, relax just a little bit, Peter. All right? By the way, Peter, if you've got a problem with Jesus doing a cleansing work on your feet, your mind is really going to be blown when you see Jesus get on the cross doing a cleansing work for your heart. No one else objected, but Peter wants to show somehow that he's better than those around him, and so Jesus just kind of ignores it, and he says, what I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. And Peter kind of doubles down on his refusal. Never shall you wash my feet, Lord. And Jesus is like, okay, cool. If I don't wash your feet, then you have no part with me. You're not really with me. You don't support me. You're not one of my own. And then Peter does a 180. All right, Lord, then give me a bath. The point is simply this. Don't get caught up in a debate. And with social media, let me just tell you right from the start, don't get caught up in the debate. Don't take the bait that's going to lead to an argument. You're not going to change their mind, and you're going to come off looking pretty arrogant. And I like what Jesus teaches us here. He doesn't spend any time getting caught up in the debate. He's not going to argue. He's going to humbly approach the situation, but he spends zero time explaining why he's doing what he's doing to Peter and the rest of the disciples. He's going to serve, he's going to love, and he's going to do it humbly, but he's not going to argue about it. Hey, question, did Peter get his feet washed? Absolutely he did. But Jesus wasn't about to argue with him about it. And if you're trying to serve and someone doesn't like the way that you're doing it and they don't want you to do it, don't argue or debate with them about it. You do it anyway, if your motives are right. Don't serve just to make the person mad, but humble yourself and don't debate about it. Okay? Sixth lesson that we learn about humility, and I believe it's a comforting lesson from Jesus. Don't pretend, just humble yourself. Jesus now is in dialogue with Peter, trying to convince him that he doesn't need a bath, and so he says in verse 10, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And Peter, you are clean, but not all of you are clean. Why did Jesus say that? Who's Jesus talking about there at the end of verse 10? Well, verse 11 makes it pretty clear who he's talking about. For he knew the one who was betraying him, and for this reason Jesus said, not all of you are clean. So Jesus takes the outside washing and he looks inwardly at the heart, and he's looking at the men around the table and he says, not all of you are clean. Isn't that amazing? He's not pretending. He's not blindly unaware. He's not naive. Jesus knows exactly what is going on, and guess what? Judas gets his feet washed anyway. Make a note of this. Humility doesn't ignore reality. And you don't have to pretend. If you know that that person doesn't like you, you don't have to pretend that they do. You just got to simply humble yourself in that moment. Remember the fear of feeling like a doormat if we humble ourselves and if we serve those who have a problem with us? Now, Jesus has just given us permission to say, look, it's okay if you understand that they don't like you. And not everybody is going to like you. It's interesting, in this upper room meal as it unfolds, Jesus very clearly will state time and time again, look, there's somebody here who doesn't have pure heart or pure motives. He's like, I know what he's doing. I know how he's acting. I know what he's up to. I'm not stupid. But Jesus doesn't turn a blind eye to what's happening behind the scenes in the heart and in the mind of Judas. He simply serves him anyway. And there will be some people who are fake to your face and then talk about you behind your back. And you don't have to pretend that you don't know what's going on. But you do have to humble yourself with that person. And that's the pill that's hard to swallow. Look, humility is meekness. It's not weakness. It's meekness. It's power under control. And if you think that meek means weak, then try being meek for a week. And you'll soon see that it's a lot harder than what you think it is. This might help you understand what humility is too. Humility is not groveling. Oh, please, I don't know what your problem is. Why don't you love me? Why won't you be my friend? That's not what humility is. Notice Jesus washed the disciples' feet. He didn't lick their feet, okay? It's not groveling. Second of all, humility is not enabling. Maybe some of you have a husband who is not a Christian, and he likes to drink. And after he gets about 6 or 8 beers in him, well, everything totally changes, and he melts down, and he becomes belligerent. So if he calls you on a Friday afternoon and says, hey, can you pick up a 12-pack of beer on your way home from work? You don't have to do that. You don't have to submit yourself in some sort of sinful behavior that will ultimately hurt you and hurt them. You can say no. You don't have to enable people as you humble yourself. Okay? And most importantly, you need to understand that humility is not manipulating. You notice Jesus wasn't like, hey, Judas, I'm going to wash your feet. I'm going to serve you, but now I expect you to change and elevate me and show me appreciation. Jesus didn't expect Judas to change after he washed his feet. He wasn't like, hey, you might want to rethink your 30 pieces of silver thing, Judas, because I just humbled myself and washed your feet. There was no manipulation here. And by the way, you know you've humbled yourself for the wrong reasons when you quickly revert to pride when you don't get the result that you wanted. Let me say that again. You know you've humbled yourself for the wrong reasons when you quickly revert to pride when you don't get the result that you wanted. When you do something for someone and it doesn't produce the result that you expected, you weren't being humble, you were being manipulative. Plain and simple. And humility is not manipulation. 7th lesson that we learn from Jesus. Set the example. And if there was room on the screen and in your bulletin, I would have said, set the example by following the example. Look at verses 12 through 15. So when Jesus had washed their feet, he had taken his garments and reclined at the table, and he said to them, do you know what I've done to you? And I love that question. Because look back at verse 7. Peter didn't understand what was being done to him. And Jesus said, what I'm doing to you do not understand now, but you'll understand it hereafter. And I love that it takes place like 6 minutes later. Jesus is explaining to Peter what's happening. Because in my life, when someone says, well, you know what, we may not understand now, but we'll understand later. Well, what does later usually mean? Later usually means months later, years later, maybe in heaven I'll understand someday. But isn't it amazing that here Jesus says, look, what I'm going to do to you don't understand, but you'll understand hereafter. And then hereafter is like here. And what he's saying, verse 7 says, what I do you do not understand, but you'll understand hereafter. Verse 12, do you understand what I've done to you? Jesus asks very tenderly. And I imagine the response on their faces says it all. No, could you explain? Here it comes, verse 13. You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. If then I, the Lord and your teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. Man, that's not what I thought was coming. Did you? What I thought was coming was, if I, the Lord and your teacher, have washed your feet, surely someone in this room can wash my feet. I'm the only one here with dirty feet. That's what I thought was coming. But that's not what Jesus says. Jesus takes humility to a whole different level, and he doesn't even mention his name. Make note of this, that the servant oftentimes gets lost in the service. Part of being a servant is that servants are taken for granted. They usually are never acknowledged or thanked. In Luke's gospel, Jesus gives an illustration about a servant who doesn't get thanked. He's simply doing what he's supposed to do. And maybe that describes a lot of you, and you're feeling a little bit, taken for granted, a little underappreciated. Maybe Luke chapter 17, verses 7 through 10 will help you. Jesus says, "Which of you having a slave plowing or tending sheep will say to him when he has come in from the field, 'Oh, come in, you've worked so hard, sit down here and eat'? Instead, doesn't he say to him, 'Prepare something for me to eat and properly clothe yourself,' in other words, clean yourself up, 'and serve me while I eat and while I drink, and afterward you can eat and drink when I've had my fill.'" Verse 9, "He does not thank the slave because he did the things which he was commanded to do, does he? So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded of you, say, 'We are unworthy slaves, we have done only that which we ought to have done.'" When you're serving, get this in your mind. The servant gets lost in the service. We don't even know if Jesus got his feet washed. It doesn't say. Will the servant be appreciated? We just don't know. But that's part of humility. Letting go of the expectation that people will see that it's costing you something to serve them. And so Jesus quietly finishes, and then he sits down to debrief them, and he says in verse 15, "For I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you." This is really important because people have said, well, Jesus commanded us to make disciples and baptize disciples. And those who might oppose baptism would also say, yeah, but Jesus also commanded us to wash each other's feet, and we don't do that. Why not? It's really important that you understand what it says there in verse 15. "For I gave you an," what's it say? "An example." What does that mean? It means that it's one way of many ways to humble yourself and serve one another. And what I want you to do in this moment is to think and answer this question: how can you humbly serve? How can you humbly serve? Look around. Who needs you? What ministry needs you? Understand it may cost you something. It may not be appreciated. Are you okay with that? Write down the name of one way that you can humbly serve. And I want you to think and answer this question: what would our church look like if there was more humble service towards one another in love? If we put the needs of others ahead of my own needs and my own wants, what would Burnside Christian Church look like? Radically different. Don't debate. Don't pretend. Set the example. Just two more. Eighth lesson we learn from Jesus about humility: understand your place. Look at verse 16. "Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is the one who sent greater than the one who sent him." So the reason that Jesus says verse 16, you understand, out of all these verses, why is it that Jesus is saying this to his disciples now? It's because his disciples forgot their place. They came in the room arguing, debating, "I'm better than you are, I'm the greatest, I deserve to be served." They forgot their place, and Jesus had to remind them of their place. And so he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is the one who sent greater than the one who sent him." couple of phrases I want to talk about real quickly. The first is the slave. Does that word bother you? Here's what you need to understand. Biblical slavery looks way different than American history slavery, okay? You might also be well to know that the word slave can actually be translated servant. If you have an NIV, it usually translates the word servant instead of slave. The idea is the same, though. You're not your own. You've been bought with a price. And you have one purpose in this life, serving the master, that's God. And I like what it says at the end there of verse 16. Nor is the one who was sent greater than the one who sent him. What is he saying there? He's saying that the one who delivers the message isn't as great as the one who wrote the message. And that speaks to me. And so when there's fighting and when there's disagreement within a church, it's a lot like those 12 disciples entering the upper room, arguing about who's the greatest. Not a lot of humility going on. And Jesus would remind those 12 men, and he would remind me, and he would remind you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is the one who sent him greater than the one, nor is the one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. And so make a note of this, only God is great. And so if you hear somebody complaining, next time you have my permission to look them in the face and remind them, look, only God's great. And you're complaining because you don't have things your way. Well, this isn't about you anyway. It's about God. We have to remember our place. It's time we got off our high horse and remember that we are servants of God. We're not a king. We're not a queen. We're a slave. We're a servant. And then finally, the final lesson, it's an action, not a concept. Humble yourself. Mark, didn't we already learn this lesson back in verses 4 and 5? Didn't we already learn these lessons? That there were 7 actions that humility requires. If we're going to be humble, we have to do humble things. And I would say yes. But this lesson must have been so important that Jesus wanted to make sure we didn't miss it. And so he says in verse 17, if you know these things, you're blessed if you know them. Is that what he says? If you know these things, you're blessed if you do them. Now, don't misunderstand this. Knowing is important. It's important that you know some things. Parents, you went to great efforts to teach your kids that the oven is hot, right? That if they touch the burner while it's on, they're going to get burned. Knowing is really important, okay? But Jesus, and knowing about humility is important. You need to know some things about humility. You need to understand some things about humility. But notice Jesus goes on to say that knowing without doing is pointless. If I know the stove is hot when it's on, but I touch it anyway, that's pretty pointless. That knowledge didn't help me a great deal. And so too, if we know about being humble, if we know what Jesus said about being humble, but I don't humble myself, then we're wasting our time. If this sermon doesn't take root within your heart and in your life and produce some humble fruit within you, we're wasting our time. And so, some of you might need to embrace this sermon. You might need to confess to the people that you came with today and say, you know what, that was God speaking to me today. I want you to know that I was listening. I want you to know that I'm going to apply it. And I want to do better about being humble. And so as we wrap up, a review very quickly about the 9 lessons on humility. When it's hardest to love, humble yourself. When it's personal, when it's painful, humble yourself. Get the big picture. That'll help you humble yourself. Understand God's in control. Understand who you are in Christ. If you want to be humble, you got to do humble things. Don't debate. Don't get lost up in the argument. Humble yourself. Don't pretend. You don't have to be naive about things. Just humble yourself. And then set the example by following the example that Jesus himself set. Humble yourself. Understand your place. God only is great. And then finally, it's an action, not a concept. Humble yourself. I want to ask if you would to stand together with me this morning. And as you do so, what lesson about humility have you needed to know the most? We've had 2 weeks now, 2 weeks worth of sermons talking about being humble. What lesson that Jesus teaches us in John chapter 13 have you needed to embrace and apply to your life? I'm going to pray, and then we're going to have a time decision. Let's pray. We're going to sing our song of decision here this morning, and it's very appropriate. It just simply says, we fall down, we lay our crowns at the feet of Jesus. We recognize that the things that I may have accomplished, the things that I may have achieved in this life are garbage when compared with what Jesus did for me. Let's sing this morning, and if you've got a decision that needs to be made, would you please come forward and make that known? Our crowns at the feet of Jesus. The greatness of your mercy and love at the feet of Jesus. And we cry, holy, holy, holy. And we cry, holy, holy, holy. And we cry, holy, holy, holy is the Lamb. We lift you up, you fill our cup at the feet of Jesus. Our sins you bore, a love so outpoured at the feet of Jesus. And we cry, holy, holy, holy. And we cry, holy, holy, holy. And we cry, holy, holy, holy is the Lamb. A love so strong, a struggle so long at the feet of Jesus. Our sin and shame were taken away at the feet of Jesus. And we cry, holy, holy, holy. And we cry, holy, holy, holy. And we cry, holy, holy, holy is the Lamb. And we cry, holy, holy, holy is the Lamb. In just a moment, I'm going to ask Scott Whitehouse to close us in prayer, but I want to remind you of a couple of things. First of all, if you would, please do me a huge favor. Fill out the sermon survey as I prepare. Pray for me. I'll be planning out a year's worth of sermons, hopefully, Lord willing, this week for 2022. That'd be something that I think we all need, but please fill that out. Second of all, I want to invite you to our movie night tonight. This isn't just for kids, although we hope kids come and enjoy themselves. It's for all the adults who love and think that they're kids, this one included. And we're going to have free popcorn, candy, water, and we're going to be doing that indoors. We're not going to do it in here. We're going to be doing it out in the fellowship hall. And so it's going to be really important for you to bring your lawn chair, because we're not intending to set up any tables or chairs. Bring your lawn chair, come, or your boat, and come and sit and enjoy a movie tonight. Just enjoy some fun fellowship tonight. Also, don't forget the telecare ministry that Matt is be starting. We would really love for you to sign up and participate in that. If you've got questions, go see Matt. He would love to answer those questions for you. Scott, please close us out.
Father God, I thank you for this day. Thank you for the blessing. Lord God, you said that sin and our shame is taken away. But Lord God, we are so quick to put them back on. We so quickly take on those things sometimes in our life. Lord God, let us lay them down at your feet, each and one of them every day. And through that, realize that we can reach out and know that you can. Lord God, bless